Hello, welcome to this webinar by Arab Center, Washington, D.C., titled "The Conflict in Sudan, Will the Humanitarian Ceasefire Translate into a Political Resolution?" My name is Imad Harb. I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. On April 15, fighting broke out in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, between the country's two largest armed forces, the Sudanese Armed Forces led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and paramilitary rapid support forces led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known also as Hemeti. The two generals were allies during former President Omar al-Bashir's rule and rose to power after he was ousted from government, and then after a military coup in 2021, they became the two basically rulers of the country. The armed struggle between the two has turned Khartoum and other areas of the country into war zones and created a humanitarian crisis with more than 1,000 killed and almost 1 million displaced, actually more than 1 million displaced, as civilians continue to bear the brunt of the conflict. As Sudan marks a month and a half of warfare, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is convening a panel of experts to discuss these recent developments and their humanitarian impact, the potential for the recent Saudi-US brokered ceasefire agreement to hold. This is really something very, very interesting, what's going on, and the prospects for a peaceful and democratic transition. Panelists will discuss the motivations of the two generals, the severe hardships Sudanese civilians and those fleeing the violence are facing, the failures of multiple ceasefires, the status of the current peace talks in Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, they were announced to have been suspended yesterday, and the role of regional and global players in the conflict, including Libya's Khalifa Haftar, the United Arab Emirates, and the Wagner Group. What are the impacts and implications of the fighting for both Sudan and the region? What are the prospects for an end to the violence? What should be done to protect civilians and ensure access to humanitarian aid? What policy recommendations can be made for the international community and the United States to support Sudan's democratic process and prevent another period of authoritarian rule by military elites? Each of the panelists today will have about 10 minutes to present their remarks. They will speak in this order, and the order that I will introduce them now. First, we have Khalid Mustafa Medani. He is chair of the African Studies Program and associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the Islamic Studies Institute at McGill University. And he will cover understanding Sudan's military rule, the roots of the political crisis and recent violent conflict. Nada Mustafa Ali, who's senior lecturer of women's gender and sexuality studies at College of Liberal Arts and board member of the Massachusetts Sudanese Community Association. She will be discussing gender equality and Sudan's transition. Samah Salman, who is a business executive, Sudanese private sector, president of the U.S. Educated Sudanese Association. She will be talking about humanitarian situation, the short-term and long-term humanitarian ramifications of the current conflict. Alan Boswell is project director for the Horn of Africa, the International Crisis Group, and he will be talking about the role of regional players in the conflict, foreign intervention, and the Wagner Group, and the role of the international community. Namat Ahmadi, who is the founder and president of the Darfur Women's Action Group. Her topic will be a focus on Darfur and the current state of affairs, 20 years of a humanitarian crisis in the region, and linking the recent violence to the genocide that took place in Darfur. And then finally, last but not least, Hulud Khair, who is the managing director of Confluence Advisory, and she will be talking about Sudan's political process and expectations for peace talks and ceasefires and policy recommendations for the United States. Thank you very much for being with us today. Khalid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, First of all, I wanted to thank, of course, since I'm going first, the Arab Center in Washington. And on behalf, if you don't mind me saying, of my Sudanese colleagues and friends that I see regularly these days, I'd like to thank you for covering Sudan. And of course, very privileged to be here with Mr. Boswell, whose work has been so important for all of us and what is going on in Sudan. So we want to thank the organizers and yourself. Since I'm going first, I thought I would give just a background that is familiar to the speakers, but perhaps not to the listeners. And look at the roots of the conflict, the disagreement that led between General Burhan of the army and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, the disagreement that led to this conflict, and then look at quickly some future scenarios. I'd like to do that in reference to other conflict settings very briefly. We're often asked what the root of the conflict is in Sudan. And for this present conflict, I would date it to the coup of 1989, the summer of 1989. There are two elements to focus on. One of them is that this conflict is really rooted in that coup that was led at that time by Omar Bashir, backed by the Islamist movement in the country, particularly Hassan Turabi and the National Islamic Front, later transformed into the National Congress Party. The other element was the conflict in Darfur that began in 2003. These two historical critical junctures in Sudan really are what led us to what we're witnessing today, a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions, even by the standard of our troubled country in Sudan, 1.4 million at least internally displaced and hundreds of thousands that have fled to other countries. What is it about the coup of 1989 that has been so formative in leading towards this path towards civil conflict or rather civil war in Sudan? I would just very quickly and directly mention what Sudanese know full well, and that is the policy of empowerment, tamkeen, that was implemented by Bashir and the Islamist movement under the rule of the National Congress Party. There were pillars that are well known by now of this policy that was implemented, partly to buttress the authoritarian reign of the Islamist regime, but it was also a policy or pillars of policies that were implemented in order to forestall what I think really is the most important concern for all Sudanese and those concerned for Sudan, and that is to stymie and prevent in any way possible by military means the opportunity or the possibility rather of a transition of Sudan from autocracy to a civilian democracy. What are the most important pillars of that period after the coup that we should keep in mind? I want to focus on, highlight four, but focus really on two. One of them is what we call the use of the state to remove assets from those not loyal to the National Congress Party and the Islamists in order to amass vast wealth in what, of course, scholars of Arab authoritarianism understand as a dawla al-aqima, the deep state, which is one of the pillars of this policy. The other one was the transformation of the bureaucracy, that is expelling, purging, detaining non-Islamists from the bureaucracy, which was really important. Another element was the transformation or domination of the financial markets, which really become important as a source of recruitment for the National Congress Party. But perhaps most important for our purposes today was the policy of actually preventing the possibilities, as I said, of the Sudanese long historical striving for a full democracy and democratization. This policy had to do with the security sector. Like many other countries, and unfortunately the regime did it successfully, what they did was to factionalize the militias or create militias for two reasons. One of them was to put down any possibility of insurgency that, of course, was occurring not only in the south, but throughout the country. Another aspect was to really prevent any possible internal coups of the kind that literally is happening today as we speak. And that is to undermine the power of the national army. When the revolution was later to come in 2019, and what we see now essentially is the increasing rise historically in the last couple of decades of a paramilitary militia and a very weakened national army struggling to take over the country. That state of affairs really began in the context of the implementation of these policies and the factionalization of the security apparatus, not just the military apparatus, under the National Congress Party and the Islamists. This is, for your viewers not familiar with Sudan, is really important because it brings us to the current state of affairs, which really date to 2003 and the Darfur conflict. We're often asked, as we should, what is the relationship to the conflict in Darfur that many people in the US and others are aware of, and the present conflict? I want to argue, and I'm sure there's full agreement here, that it was central for two reasons. In 2003, the policy, although it dates a little bit back under the previous government in Sudan, what occurred was the use of proxy militias in, unfortunately, a successful war, a proxy war against the insurgents in Darfur that killed, as many of you know, 200,000 innocent civilians and displaced over 1 million across the boundaries. The reason that's important, number one, it speaks to the horrible humanitarian crisis that we see now, but actually began in the western part of the country. And it also, in this period, particularly following 2006 and 7, where we see the emergence of these two protagonists at the moment, General Abdel Fattah Burhan and Hemeti, really basically grew and found prosperity and wealth and political alliance with the central government and Bashir during this period. It is here that they became valuable and were utilized by the central government and by Bashir to put down those insurgency. By 2013, Bashir was so enamored by the utility of the rapid Hemeti that he formalized the Rapid Support Forces, and in 2017 legalized them as a support base for the National Standing Army. Another aspect of the Darfur conflict was really the way in which these kind of wars were prosecuted. The strategy of displacing people from homes, of the street battles that we see in Khartoum, all of that was fashioned, designed, not irrationally, but as a weapon of war. What we see now in Khartoum are the strategies built over time in Darfur and the emergence, of course, and the legacy of these two protagonists. I don't want to go on too long, but I just wanted to bring us very quickly up to date and make the argument that is central here, and that is what's occurring now is very much similar to the initial policies of the Bashir regime following their coup. And that is the fight against the will of the Sudanese people and their struggle, historical struggle for a transition to full civilian democracy. The 2018-2019 revolution was actually seminal in this, and that becomes a really important aspect. The continued revolution of that period, I only have a couple of minutes, is really can be categorized as essentially a partnership between Hemeti and Burhan as they sought in any way possible to displace any civil society participants, particularly those who were the pro-democracy revolutionaries themselves, having implemented a coup to stop that path towards civilian democracy in 2021. What occurred, of course, is Sudanese, because of, believe it or not, the strength of civil society, continued to protest, leading to them being forced to get around the table with the international community and actors in order to implement the framework agreement. I know my colleagues are going to spell this out in great detail, but I just wanted to highlight that the central problem of the framework agreement from the beginning were two things. One of them was the deferring of key contentious issues, including, of course, issues of justice, including the issue of dismantling this economy built over so many decades, 30 decades, and including, most importantly, distressingly, this issue of not tackling security sector reform. Another issue that was central to the agreement is and I think that Mr. Boswell is going to emphasize this, and I know he's written about it, and that is the exclusion of stakeholders in civil society. Why is that important, and why do I mention it as I conclude? And that has to do with the negotiations going on right now. I'm not going to talk about the politicization of the external actors, but I want to say something technical about the negotiations that I think is worthy of note. And here I refer to successful cases in Liberia and Sierra Leone and other African settings. And that is the exclusion of civil society actors in negotiations may seem to external actors as expedient. It may seem as streamlining a complex process, but what we know from the literature and the cases throughout the African continent, that the exclusion of civil society actors, which is what is occurring in Jeddah today, does two important or raises two important problems. One of them, does not set a kind of agenda, the agenda setting role so critical for civil society stakeholders who actually can come up with an agenda that is really important and potentially successful. Another crucial aspect with the exclusion of civil society actors in these negotiations, and here I have to emphasize is, we have no cases with the exclusion of civil society of durable peacemaking and peace building. As we go forward discussing a phase of post-conflict, hopefully, inshallah, or peace building, we have to understand the lessons from other cases in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in other countries, even in Rwanda, where the exclusion of civil society in pre-negotiations, in addition to the phases of the mediation process, actually does not set an agenda for permanent peace, and it actually undermines any possibility for durable peace and resolution of conflict, so important to not only Sudanese, which is crucial to us, but those countries, regional, external, international, concerned about the instability in Sudan and the region. Thank you for your time. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Khalid. Nada?
Thank you very much. I would like to echo Khalid's thanks to Al-Markaz Al-Arabi, the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., for organizing this panel and for inviting us to speak. It is an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I will start by saying that Sudan has always been at war and excessively militarized. And the only difference regarding this current conflict is that this war had officially extended to the capital of Sudan. I think that's the only difference, actually. Starting on April 15th. This does not mean that security prevailed prior to that date, including in greater Khartoum. The city has been extensively militarized for decades and in recent years with army and RSF soldiers and trucks at almost every street corner of Khartoum. I was able to witness that when I went back to Khartoum in January of this year. In the 10 minutes allotted to me, I want to talk about framing, by the way, and how do we frame our thinking about the current conflict in Sudan? How do we shape strategies, policies, and action on Sudan? Of course, the answer is it depends. It depends on where we stand in relation to the conflict and what do we think is at stake and whose voices we should prioritize. Of course, the priority right now is to end the war and to bring those responsible for the atrocities to justice. This time, and build peace at all levels and to ensure the survival of the people of Sudan, including those stranded in Khartoum, internally displaced people, and those who had to cross the border to neighboring countries, including through recognizing and supporting local initiatives by neighborhood level resistance committees, street vendor cooperatives, and others. And in so doing, I am going to argue for ensuring the meaningful involvement of women and ensuring gender equality. This should always be a key concern and an integral part of our discussions, debates, policies, or practices that are related to the ongoing violence in Sudan. And this includes questions on humanitarian support and ceasefire, peace negotiations, and any potential political resolution to the conflict itself. I'm going to start by defining gender. By the way, I see it as because I do so because for many actors within Sudan, this is oftentimes a confusing concept. I see it as the social and cultural construction of differences between the sexes and as the roles, functions, and responsibilities that communities assign to its community members. I see it as a tool of analysis and a power relationship. I believe that gender intersects with other aspects of difference, including race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background. And those are all factors actually in the current conflict, as Khalid Madani alluded earlier. And I think that together, these aspects shape the experiences of Sudanese citizens and communities currently directly affected by the war in distinct ways. And this is why we need to ensure that gender perspective is part of any thinking about ending the current crisis in Sudan, and that women are meaningfully involved in the process. In any process of peace building and post-conflict reconstruction in the future. I will give very few examples, given the limited time allotted to each one of us. One of the very first documented civilian casualties that happened in mid-April was the killing of a woman who was in labor and on her way to Saad Abu al-Ila Hospital on Muhammad Najib Street, not too far from where our home is in Sudan. When RSF soldiers, Rapid Support Forces soldiers, stopped the car she was in, the driver continued on his way to the hospital because it was an emergency. And unfortunately, they shot her and shot others in that car. Of course, unlike many other procedures and operations, it is impossible to postpone or reschedule labor. It is also impossible to suddenly postpone a woman's menstrual cycle, by the way, of course, regardless of whether, like cotton wool or pads were available. During the few days that followed the eruption of violence, I reached out to one of the agencies in Khartoum without mentioning the name of the agency to ask whether their offices in Sudan had dignity or hygiene kits that women active at the local level had asked for since the very first day of the war, but I received no response at the time. There are reports, of course, of sexual violence, especially in the greater Khartoum area, but also in El Geneina, in Darfur. And the Violence Against Women Prevention Unit has provided us with numbers, about 450 cases of rape. And of course, this is a conservative figure because not everyone reports rape due to the stigma against victims and survivors and not perpetrators of sexual violence. And even before this unit issued this number, several women active at the local level that I had been in touch with shared information about cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence against women who were often abducted and taken to abandoned buildings and then raped. Of course, this reminds us of what had happened in Darfur in 2003 and 2004. It has happened in South Sudan and in other war-affected areas in Sudan, where women and others in their communities lost not only their lives and livelihoods, some were displaced, and many were at the receiving end of sexual and gender-based violence. This is all extensively documented, of course, but I would like to emphasize that the impact of such atrocities persists for generations to come in the same way that militarization often outlives armed conflicts. And this has been very clear in the case of earlier conflicts of in Sudan. And of course, there are other social groups that the war had affected in unique ways beyond direct killing by military artillery or at the hands of the RSF. Those include, for example, older citizens, many of whom died actually during long journeys, especially to the northern border of Sudan and off to Egypt, young orphans and abandoned children in Al-Maygoma Center for children who lack support in Khartoum, for example. I'm sure many of you have read reports recently that over 50 of Al-Maygoma children had died recently. Children in some of the communities in Khartoum actually have died due to illnesses and malnutrition. Some of my contacts on the ground tell me. Also, of course, numerous citizens have lost their homes or their homes were looted or destroyed. And so despite all this, we now know very well that women from war-affected communities have shown or had shown immense resilience, creativity, and power in addressing similar circumstances elsewhere, including in other parts of Sudan. In my previous research, I have documented hundreds of these stories, and like starting in the mid-1990s. And I think that these experiences and the experiences of women in other war-affected countries within the African countries, in the Middle East and beyond, teach us that women, including, like in some of the countries that my colleague Khalid mentioned earlier, are oftentimes able to build powerful movements and are able to sustain their societies during war. And I think that policymakers need to draw on these strengths at present, in the same way that, thankfully, they have been drawing on the strengths of neighborhood level resistance committee, for example. The organizers had asked me to speak very briefly about the uprising itself and women's role in it. And I have one sentence to say, that women have really played important roles in this uprising, and it is quite well documented at present. And I think that the uprising and its aftermath has actually invigorated women's organizing and movements. And so now there are numerous women's organizations, initiatives, and networks across Sudan who are working in small and larger levels to address some of the basic needs at community level, and also thinking about and writing about peace and peace building and the role that women can play in that. We know that there was representation, or women were represented at various levels in the first transitional government, but this representation was limited at the end of the day. And there are basic actions, like preliminary actions, that that government needed to take, which did not happen. And that was very surprising to me. I'm asking why the transitional government, for example, never carried out a countrywide gender assessment. Why don't we have a national household health survey or a census? Why didn't we have a gender policy? These are all important questions, and they are relevant, by the way, to the current moment. And these are really important steps, by the way, that could have helped shed light on what women across the country were going through. And this would have been early early warning signs of, the coming of insecurity and volatility, which was taking place and continued even during the transitional period in outside of Khartoum. And I want to end by engaging with one of the questions that the organizers of this panel posed, taking into account what I had just said. This question is whether the humanitarian ceasefire would translate into a political resolution. And I would say that at the face of it, this is not necessarily likely at present. And to start with, both sides have violated or suspended even short-term ceasefire agreements numerous times. And second, the current hostilities between the army and the RSF are not necessarily, purely political, of course. There are some speculations that each side at least aligns with the agenda of certain political forces. The RSF has recently adopted a discourse that allegedly seeks democratization and the return of power to civilians while killing civilians at the same time. It doesn't necessarily look like a liberation or a democratic movement to me. And also many in the military are... Sorry?
Could we wrap up a little bit, please?
Sure, yeah. Okay,
maybe you can defer that to later on to continue the discussion.
Sure. What I would say is that I was going to talk also about the armed forces on the other side, but what I would like to say at the very end, maybe to conclude with, is that as Sudanese people, we have a really important prerequisite, and that is to work on transforming our political parties and movements and political coalitions, and also our civil society platforms. We have to work very hard on reforming these structures for us to be able to build a genuine democracy. We need to ensure that our politics is not exclusively elitist, that it is genuinely inclusive and transparent. Because when the going gets tough, it's not, a party or a military that pays the price. It is the women in labor. It is the children of Al-Maigoma. It is street vendors who are not able to take a day off work because violence is taking place in their neighborhoods. And I will talk in the discussion about existing policy frameworks that Sudanese people and also the Friends of Sudan can draw on in addressing gender inequality and insecurity also in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Welcome, Namat. Hello, how are you?
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, just a little to apprise you on how we're doing. I have Samah will speak, and then Alan, and then your turn will come after Alan. It's a 10-minute presentation, and Samah, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thank you, Tamara, and I'd like to thank the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. for hosting us. I actually have a few slides. So my 10 minutes, I'll take you through some slides and talk about the humanitarian situation and speak about the ceasefire and some recommendations, policy recommendations. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? Is that
yes.
okay? Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is really talk about the conflict, what some of the motivations are behind the conflict, why it's a winner-takes-all conflict. I'll address the humanitarian crisis, I'll do a short-term and a long-term assessment, and then I'll speak to the spillover effects of the war on neighboring countries. We'll look at the ceasefire, some factors that may influence success or failure, and then finally, ending the war, how do we do that? Some policy recommendations. This war between General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and General Hemedti, it is a violent war. It's basically a scorched earth war strategy. These two men, there are three reasons why they are so adamant about winning the war at all costs and destroying Sudan in the process. One is their political ambitions. They want control of the central government of Sudan. The second is their economic and financial empires that they're seeking to protect. Jointly, these two generals control 85% of Sudan's economy. They control the gold mines, they control the uranium, they control the diamonds, they control most of the large agricultural schemes, they control some of the gum Arabic trade, they control a lot of the strategic sectors of Sudan. So they're protecting their economic empires. And finally, accountability. Both General Burhan and General Hemedti have committed war crimes and atrocities. They have both been complicit in the Darfur war and the Darfur genocide, and General Burhan has a history that takes him back to committing atrocities in the South Sudan war. Looking at the humanitarian crisis and what's going on, most of you are familiar, and most of you have a pretty good understanding of what's going on in terms of the tragedy ongoing right now in Sudan. So Sudanese are dying by bullets, by air shelling. They're dying from hunger and illness. I mean, there are massive food, medicine, power, water, fuel, and internet shortages. Evacuations have taken place, and diplomatic missions, UN and INGOs have largely left Sudan. Really, the only organization in the first few days of the war that was on the ground in Sudan was MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières. Some of these people who have evacuated have been quoted as describing the dead corpses on the street like the movie Armageddon. I mean, this is really how bad it is. In terms of casualties, the reports are 865 people have been killed. We know the numbers are much higher than that. We know that just in the last 2 weeks, 2,000 people have been killed in Jenin alone. The estimates, and Ni'mat will go into this, probably more than 5,000 in Darfur, more than 6,000 in Khartoum. We're talking about upwards of 11,000. These are the more likely to be realistic numbers. Baby orphans have died in my Goma orphanage just out of hunger. Injuries, again, upward of 5,500. That's the recorded number, but estimates could be 3 or 4 times that much. 70% of hospitals are out of service. 1.4 million Sudanese have been displaced. There were already 3.3 million internally displaced people, Sudanese, in Sudan. 1 million more have been displaced since the beginning of the war in the last 6 weeks, taking that to a total of 4.4 million. 376,000 Sudanese have crossed the border to neighboring countries. The humanitarian need is acute. Before the war, 15.8 million Sudanese were dependent on humanitarian aid. Now the number is 24.7 million. That is almost half of Sudan's population, or actually just about exceeding half of Sudan's population. I mean, this is a really serious crisis. The UN has estimated that the total requirement to the end of the year is $3 billion to address this humanitarian crisis. USAID has pledged $245 million. There have been shipments from some of the Gulf countries and some of these INGOs to the tune of about another 200 million, but the shortage is huge, and that's why I put this picture here of the comparison of the line to help Ukraine and the line to help Sudan. This has the potential to become the largest humanitarian crisis in recent history. What are the spillover effects of the war into neighboring countries? I mean, we can see here the numbers. 169,000 Sudanese have crossed into Egypt, 100,000 into Darfur. Many of these are Sudanese who have been refugees 2 or 3 or 4 times already, 10,000 into the Central African Republic, 81,000 to South Sudan. And many of these South Sudanese are returnees. And then there are upwards of 6,000 to 8,000 are the estimates into Ethiopia. South Sudan is very much reliant on Sudan oil production inputs in the pipeline. So there's really potential for economic collapse. There's the risk of the surplus of arms going in and fueling some of the militias and further destabilizing South Sudan. The same goes true for the surplus of arms and militias in Chad. So that's a real risk of an already fragile nation becoming further destabilized. The same can be said for the Central African Republic. Egypt is going through an economic recession. You have more than 150,000 Sudanese going in. There's positives to that and negatives. The negatives is that they're going to put a strain on the economy. Some of these Sudanese, though, are coming in with hard currency and buying properties. So it's a mixed effect. It's both positive and negative. Ethiopia, the numbers going into Ethiopia are mostly returnees, refugees who had come into Sudan from the Ethiopian war. If they are armed, that could threaten an already fragile peace agreement in Ethiopia. The ceasefire, I'm sure we are all, following what's happening with the Saudi-US-led Jeddah talks. Just yesterday, the Sudanese armed forces indicated that they were withdrawing from the talks. They were upset, and their grievance is that the RSF is not being held accountable for their violation of the ceasefire. The talks, there are 3 phases to the talks. The first phase is for an immediate ceasefire for safe humanitarian corridors. The second phase is for a sustained cessation of hostilities, and that is for a permanent end to the war. And that would open up the door to the third phase, which is the return to a process for civilian democratic transition. Some of the key factors influencing the success of the ceasefire. We have a monitoring and coordinating committee. Now, assuming that the Saudis and the Americans are able to bring the SAF back to the talks, which many forecast could be likely, we really need this committee to use the accountability mechanisms to put in place punitive measures against the SAF and the RSF for violations. We really need that accountability. There needs to be more emphasis on further de-escalating the violence for life-saving emergency assistance to come in. There have been brief windows and pauses in fighting, but not enough. More engagement of local NGOs and resistance committees to reach the last mile as well. And finally, addressing HAC, which is the Sudanese Humanitarian Aid Commission violations. They continue to obstruct and block the flow of aid into Sudan, and they also need to be punished for that. Finally, some policy recommendations for ending the war. And these recommendations apply to both phase 1, the immediate ceasefire, and phase 2, the sustained cessation of hostilities. First of all, the Saudi Arabia and US We commend them on the hard work that they've put into bringing the parties to the negotiating table. These are two very difficult belligerents with a really bad track record, and with the Sudanese people have very little confidence in them. So bringing them to the negotiating table in and of itself is no small feat. Now, it really needs to be, though, a very broad coalition of the UN, IGAD, the Arab League, the EU, the Trilateral, the Quad, the Troika. All of these expanded mechanisms have to become a coalition and work together, because there can't be any sort of perceived motivations or agendas behind the ceasefire. And it needs to be an international coalition that is very strong to put a huge amount of pressure on the parties. There needs to be an expansion of the UN Security Council arms embargo. Currently, it's an arms embargo it was historically for the Darfur. It needs to be expanded for all of Sudan, and there needs to be an implementation of a no-fly zone. We know those things are challenging, but we need to press for that. This includes tight enforcement of US Arms Export Control Act and international traffic in arms regulations on Sudan, because we have seen reports of some US arms getting into Sudan. Finally, asset freezing and blocking illicit financial flows. This is the way that smuggled arms get into Sudan and continue to fuel the war. The US President Biden has put in place the Executive Order 14098, imposing targeted sanctions. We've seen a framework there, but we have not seen any names being named. It's really important that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates support this targeted sanctions framework. And that's because most of the financial flows of the SAF and the RSF actually go through these two countries. That's where most of the assets are held. And then finally, we saw recently an expansion of the executive orders sanctioning Russia. These are the Ukraine war sanctions. We want to see an expansion of those sanctions as they apply to Sudan. Why is that? Because the Wagner Group and Russian oligarchs are mostly the actors who are supplying and smuggling arms into Sudan. Sudan is the second largest buyer of Russian arms. So as much as we can see the expansion of those US executive orders as they apply to Sudan, that will help bring the war to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabah. Appreciate it. Alan, your turn.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm humbled to be part of this panel, and a shame you invited me, or else you would have had an all Sudanese panel, but thank you for the invitation. So there's a lot to say, but a lot already has been said by my previous panelists that was spot on. So I'm going to focus my remarks on what's quite broad in of itself, which is the more sort of regional and international elements of this conflict. And so there's a few different ways that you can analyze this conflict. And one of them is, of course, internal, and looking at the different internal drivers of this and the history of it, which Dr. Khalid and others went through. And of course, that's true. I want to tell a sort of another side of the story, which is how international players really got sucked into this. And I think I'm going to start. Dr. Khalid started with the 1989 coup, and then he went into the Darfur War. I'm going to talk after this RSF force was created. I think another key metric in here, which really changed, honestly, the future of Sudan, was the war in Yemen across the Red Sea. And what we saw with that war is that the Saudi and Emirati coalition leading that war asked Sudan to contribute forces. Bashir asked the army to send in forces, but then he also let the RSF send in forces as well. This allowed the RSF, who became a big contributor sort of as a parastatal mercenary force in a way in Yemen. This allowed it to grow even more beyond what it was, to sort of expand much more beyond this Darfur focused force and really grow quite a bit. Also, Hemeti and Burhan worked together in the campaign in Darfur. They also worked together in the campaign in Yemen, and it allowed both of the men to forge ties across the Red Sea, in the Gulf, in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, and that proved very critical and a turning point in Sudanese history, really, I think you could say. So in 2019, when there's the popular uprising that we all know, that did topple Bashir, the security services had been left so divided through the coup-proofing of Bashir that they essentially had to oust Bashir essentially by committee. And it was Hemeti and Burhan, and many Sudanese will argue Hemeti actually was able to choose his counterpart in Burhan due to their relationship together, who then ousted Bashir and then seized power themselves, and they were backstopped by the Gulf, which stepped in. They were keen. They'd grown increasingly tired of Bashir sort of playing everyone off of each other. This was during the GCC crisis, and it was not a time when people could try to not take sides really in the Arab world. So they didn't mind seeing Bashir go, but then they were also keen to avoid a sort of Arab Spring a scenario and all the negative connotations that had with them. This led this led to a standoff between the protesters on one side and really these security elements backed by elements in the Gulf on the other side. This led to what was a Quad meeting, which was the US, UK, Saudi Arabia and UAE, a Quad meeting in the UK in 2019, in which they were discussing Yemen, but they tabled Sudan as well. The UK did actually, and then that became sort of the informal power brokering to bring the military on one side and sort of civilians who claim to represent the protesters on the other. And of course there are other actors, including the AU and others who are serving as mediators. But this sort of led to what became the power sharing deal between civilians and the military. And so it was really backstopped there at the beginning from the Gulf on one side and the West on other, and the AU and UN eventually playing a role as well. Lead to 2021. Part of the deal of this was that I think the Gulf knew very well that Sudan was bankrupt. There was US sanctions. There was a need for IFI support from the World Bank, from the IMF to really bail out the Sudanese economy. When Burhan and Hemeti agreed in 2021 to overthrow the civilian side, the West suspended all of that aid and it put Sudan's economy in a free-for-all. And that's when you really saw when it became clear the West was not going to step back in and back Sudan's economy and that the coup had failed in that degree. That's when you saw the US and Saudi Arabia especially step in and again start brokering backroom negotiations between some of these political party elite essentially and the military, which got us to December of last year, where there was a December 2022 agreement to restore civilian rule in Sudan. I don't want to get into all the tensions that caused and the drivers of this conflict, because the other panelists have done that, and Khulud, I'm sure, will get into it as well. But so that's the sort of international architecture we had when this conflict broke out. It was the US and Saudis who'd been leading the backroom negotiations that are essentially what erupted into civil war with all this pressure to return to civilian rule. But as part of this, the tensions between Burhan and Hemeti kept growing for a number of reasons. And the Quad during this time, which was the US, UK, Saudi, and UAE, increasingly became more the US and Saudi at times. And then, of course, we've seen now after the conflict that it was the US and Saudis who stepped in very much and took the mediation initiative. And I think we have to look at some of the intra-Arab dynamics that are going along as well. So first of all, just in terms of where people now stand, I think part of the problem here was that Egypt, near the end of this process, felt excluded from this Quad process. Egypt has a long history in Sudan, and I think it resents at a certain level some of the Gulf players who've come in and also thrown their weight around, and was starting to undermine this agreement that was signed December to restore civilian rule. That was destabilizing. And so I think that's a lesson of part of the problem when all the actors who feel like they're invested are not included. Saudi Arabia has ties to both men. I think that they're seen as being more sympathetic towards the army than RSF side. They're increasingly coordinating with Cairo on this mediation. The UAE has the closest ties politically and commercially to Hemeti. Officially, they are neutral as well. But I think, the perception of them from a lot of others is that they favor the Hemeti side, fair or not, but that's a perception. I think they are also, they appear to a degree sidelined from the Jeddah process because it was the Quad and now goes down to Saudi Arabia and the US. And so that's a key, I think, thing to watch. Relations between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi have also been worsening, and it's a worrying dynamic that we're watching as well. Just to say that Qatar has been more or less lost. It was a big player before Bashir fell, very close with Bashir, lost a lot of influence, and they've been out of the picture for a while, although they have ties to a lot of the Bashir era Islamist groups. Their ties with Burhan have been improving since the coup in 2021 as well. So they might also become part of the picture later. To sort of loop around, there is these allegations from the US of Wagner support for RSF. Wagner has had gold ties with Hemeti for some time. It is not quite the security relationship that you see Wagner having with other actors in the African theater. The allegation is that there has been some movement, some supplying of anti-tank, anti-aircraft supplies through CAR to RSF. It sounds like potentially something of a one-off thus far, not necessarily sustained. And not necessarily substantial, but there are those allegations, some of which have been made public. They also align with some of, difficult to verify reports that we're also seeing. But I also think this Wagner angle, it can be very explosive in the media for obvious reasons. We don't see it as a major factor in the war thus far, but it is there. And I think, that'll obviously shape people's perceptions of the conflict. Our own reading is that Prigozhin's, Wagner's not really able to project massively, and also Hemeti is not able to project massively in Sudan, but also I think Hemeti is very keen not to be too publicly associated with him for sort of obviously reasons as well. So that's something to watch. There's been a lot of reports of supplies coming from Haftar as well. We have no smoking gun on that. It looked like there were some planes that landed in Kufra that went with something that went south to Sudan in the early days of the conflict, but we haven't seen much of that since. It's basically very difficult to tell what's going on. RSF has connections with Haftar, with Haftar's networks in Libya, and just say RSF has a lot of money, and obviously there's a very awash arms market as well. So there's a few different ways him getting supplies could work. So I think it's difficult necessarily to jump to conclusions. I think it's fair to say that they're definitely using their smuggling ties to get more supplies as they go along. Another foreign element to sort of watch is Sudan is in between Ethiopia and Egypt on this very key Gerd-Nile dispute. Ethiopia thus far has, a neutral posture, but I'll just say if we see Egypt intervene in any major fashion, it's hard not to also see Egypt intervene. So I think there's the Gulf Arab sort of side of dynamics. There's also an Egypt-Ethiopia angle here as well that bears watching. Our general read is that if the foreign intervention seal is broken in any major way, there's a real risk that Sudan becomes something of a free-for-all in which other actors feel like they need to intervene as well. And thus far, although there are reports and allegations of some support here or there, and we obviously, there's a bit more ties about, we know sort of where sympathies might lie, and also leverage. Generally, no one wants a failed state in Sudan. I think generally we've seen restraint more or less from outside actors. And I think part of that restraint is the fact that people, I think all do realize if they do step in, we're likely to see major escalation that no one will really be able to control. So finally, in terms of what the international action looks like, we have seen these talks in Jeddah. We also now have the AU stepping forward, approving a roadmap that includes a political process that they plan to move ahead. They have created a core group that includes the AU, UN, IGAD, which is the Horn of Africa bloc, the League of Arab States, which helps include Egypt as well, and the League of Arab States has endorsed the Jeddah track, as well as the Quad is included in there, which is the US, UK, Saudi, and UAE. So I think you see that that's an attempt to sort of coordinate all the main actors in one sort of forum. The problem is, of course, it is a very big group, and we haven't seen any major action yet. Something we are concerned about moving ahead is a sort of Arab security track, if you will, that's very focused on the two military sides, and a sort of African civilian track. And that's, that's more focused on politics. That's not necessarily a problem in itself. It could be an opportunity and a way to move ahead, but obviously it would be problematic if those turned into sort of increasingly polarized tracks, which is something that we've seen in other contexts. So I think this this recommendation that we've had, that we really need to see everyone pulling together in one direction, is really key. So that didn't even name all the regional actors. You have South Sudan, you have Chad, you have Eritrea, but I think it sort of shows that just how complex this is, how externalized this landscape has become. We think that Sudan is essentially slipping into state collapse. It is extremely alarming. It is a scenario that could take generations to reverse. And so we really need to see something that looks like a coordinated state rescue plan across African, Arab, Western, and multilateral. Well, it requires coordination among all those. We have not seen the high level action that is required. I think part of the challenge, for instance, on the US side, is part of this falls in the African Bureau, part of it falls in the Near East Bureau. Sudan basically can't afford to slip through the cracks. But I think just in terms of how some of this international architecture is, the way it sits between the Arab and the African world and is part of both, unfortunately, in some ways it does slip between the cracks. So I think honestly, we just need to see a lot more high level attention from Washington, from the African Union, from the UN, and really engage with this, with the urgency and gravity that requires. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Appreciate it. For the audience, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature on your Zoom page, or you can write to an email at events@arabcenter.org, arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. Thank you very much. Namat, your turn.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to our other speakers for sharing their wisdom with us today about the current situation in Sudan. Well, unfortunately, the crisis in Sudan today is a crisis of a global magnitude that requires global action to halt. But I would like to take you through the journey of how we arrive into this stage of the crisis that we are talking about it right now. It is started long time ago, 2 decades and more than 2 decades, when the crisis in Darfur started. And to just put the record straight, like it have been quoted by the media, by many internationals, that the government of al-Bashir has used military to respond to rebellion in Darfur. Unfortunately, the government has mobilized and started attacking the indigenous African in Darfur 2 years before the rebellion started. It was in early 2000, 2001, and 2003, when the al-Bashir government has mobilized its troops and also has started recruiting militias from Arab tribes, equipped them, trained, and provided them with many ammunition and weapons, and authorized them to launch scorched earth campaign of genocidal attack against three tribes, then the Four, the Masalit, and the Gawa. They destroyed food and water, burned villages, forced people to flee, used rape systematically against women and girls as a weapon of war. Back then, it was Musa Hilal that al-Bashir first recruited. He is a son of a prominent sheikh who's a traditional or civil administrator in an area in North Darfur. And then after which he recruited Ali Kosheb, who is currently one of those who are indicted for the crimes committed against the people of Darfur by the International Criminal Court and currently undergoing trial in The Hague. The two militia leaders have been mobilizing across Darfur and committing all sorts of crimes under the command of al-Bashir and the Department of Defense, the Interior Minister, and that's why Ahmed Haroun was indicted, because he was the former Interior Minister for the Darfur region, for Western Darfur at that time when he administered and led the attacks in an area called Wadi Saleh in far western and far southwestern Darfur. Unfortunately, the cries for the situation in Darfur have emphasized that what al-Bashir was doing was dangerous then, because he was using ethnic ideology to gain more power. And basically they systematically attack the people of Darfur. In Sudan, there is a saying said that the most religious people are the people of Darfur. When they came with this Islamic political Islam ideology, they saw that people of Darfur will be the natural extension for the Islamic group in the capital. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The people of Darfur were not looking for religious that they already know for years. They were looking for a government that will address their marginalization. They will advance their life, give their children education, health, and treat them equal as the rest of the Sudanese. That didn't happen. The people of Darfur abstained to participate in the first election that al-Bashir has announced after 4 years after his coup d'etat that enabled him to take over the power in Sudan. So that was like the time in which the Sudanese must have learned that there was something dangerous approaching Sudan. Then later on, Musa Hilal started growing ambitious, and he was moved into the capital and appointed as an advisor to Bashir. But then his political ambitions has represented a threat to al-Bashir government. Then now al-Bashir starts looking for someone to replace Musa Hilal and to take away some of his power. But that person has to be from Arab Rizegat of North Darfur. So they located Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, a simple man who has no ambitions, who was simply living day by day. And at some point he was one of the local criminals who cut the street for people going to the market, stealing camels from here and there. It is not like that the PR New York Times article that was written about him, that he is the richest man coming from a rich family. No, the people of Darfur know too well that was not the case of the story, but they were trying to promote the man in the work of the 2019 interim government formation. So, unfortunately, the people of Darfur cried, and we were telling the rest of the Sudanese that outsiders, foreigners, were taking over our land, because when Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo took over to take the power away from Musa Hilal, of course, he launched an invasion against Musa Hilal, arrested him, brought him to Khartoum, and he was jailed. And then now he has a free hand over Darfur, but most of the Arab militias were reluctant since Hilal was coming from a prominent family and Dagalo was coming from nothing. So they were reluctant to follow. Then he started going out to Chad, Central African Republic, Mali, and Niger. But before him, Musa Hilal has used Chad pretty much when we all remember the famous deal that they did when he was married to the daughter of the Chadian president. So that was to pursue his interest in Chad and have a free border to bring in other militias from other African countries who are of Arab origins. And then the militias start to grow. They were coming as individual fighters. Now they start bringing their families. And as of today, many of the Darfuri people lands, those who have been displaced, currently living in the internally displaced camps or refugee camps, their land has already been taken away by these people. Today, if there is peace in Sudan, the people of Darfur have to fight to get their land back. So, and how this, the current situation happened, when Bashir was indicted, Burhan was down in Darfur. He's the one who recruited Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. He was in central Darfur then when he claimed that he was the god of Four. That area is mostly populated by the Four tribe, one of the indigenous African tribes that Bashir was precisely targeting because of their lack of affiliation with the regime in Khartoum. So they did all the crimes, committed all the crimes. Then he stayed there for 4 or 5 years. He was brought to Khartoum and promoted and rewarded because of what he did. And he was a one of the close confidants of al-Bashir. And then al-Bashir was at some point also calling Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Himaiti. It's like my protector, but in a state of himity. So it was very clear and obvious that this is going to head to a dangerous situation that we may not be able to address. But at that moment, it went into a deaf ears. Then these two generals, they start growing ambitious when the international community started looking, even though al-Bashir was indicted. There are major international development happened that has shaped and contributed to current crisis that we are dealing with. The famous European Union deal with Sudan, with President al-Bashir, but then rapid support forces were the primary target, who have been supported by the 100 million euro that was appropriated and given to Sudan to curb the so-called African refugees to Europe. We protested that, and including asked for a meeting with the European Union representative. And we were so shocked, telling them that how could the European Union go around its human rights instrument and cut a deal with the president who's indicted by the very court that most of, if not all of the European Union countries or members are supportive of, to cut this deal. And then we are also express our fears that this money will be given to the rapid support forces, militias whose hand is full of the blood of the people of Darfur, who are responsible of the genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The European Union representative simply said, everyone is innocent until proved guilty. It was very hurtful to hear something like that from like a legal advisor of the European Union to say, this is for the record. Then following that, the Obama administration started the Allies forces war in Yemen. And then they also decided to start normalizing relation with al-Bashir. So talking about that and then starting the war in Yemen, Sudan was committed to take troops to fight in Yemen, as my other colleague has referenced that. So there has been a huge amount of money pledged. And then guess what? Those who are fighting in Yemen are the rapid support forces. Most Sudanese were reluctant to go fight in Yemen. So now they start going to Mali, Niger, and Central African Republic, and using these local militias, and then they promoted them because Janjaweed became an international label that known of crimes committed against the people of Darfur. Then they changed it into Rapid Support Forces to give it kind of like a better name and more kind of professional name. And then they were, instead of being part of the military, they were.
Could you wrap up a little bit, please? Could you wrap up?
Sure. They were annexed to be part of the national security institution rather than being part of the defense institution. And that is when the problem started. Then the third and the fourth factor is that the silence of the majority of Sudanese about what was taking place, what was happening in Darfur, but also what the regime was doing, what was happening in Darfur, but also there was no reason for Sudan to take these militias to go and fight in Yemen. They were coming back, they were enriching themselves and committing all kinds of crimes. So it was only in 2019 when suffering and the violation of human rights entered into every single household in Sudan, the Sudanese said this is enough. It was not about the people of Darfur, it was about the government in the center that committing crimes and violating the right of its citizens. When Bashir was asked it, there is a very important point here I wanted to point out. When Bashir was ousted, we pointed out that these two generals must not be part of the government because their hands is full of crimes. So that was brushed off and then they were brought. So we told them that they have seen how Bashir manipulated and used militarization. If they become part of the interim government, then they will use the military and the money, and they will continue to manipulate, and that interim period will never be successful. We wrote back then the strategic framework for sustainable change in Sudan that sorted out all the steps that were supposed to be taken and who should participate in the interim government and who should not.
I'm really sorry. I'm gonna.
Yes. Thank you. I will stop here and be more than happy.
Sorry about that. Khulud, could you please go ahead?
Sure. I'd like to actually pick up on what Niamat was saying and go from there, because she makes a very good point, which is that Burhan and Hemeti have been at this for a long time, and through various successive processes, they've been able to rehabilitate themselves and to insert themselves into political processes, including the one that preceded and in many ways led to this current conflict. And I think if we sort of critically assess how we got here, then we're able to see, what not to reproduce, hopefully, in future political processes. So, for example, any process that legitimizes these generals and their enterprises cannot be a way out of this conflict right now. And frankly, what we saw from the Jeddah talks was exactly that. Political talks that were in many ways legitimizing the generals after they had effectively delegitimized themselves in the most dramatic of ways in Sudan. There is no political dispensation in Sudan's future that could now conceivably have these generals. And yet what you have from the type of formats of sort of traditional orthodoxies of mediations that bring in the belligerents and have them sign pieces of paper that they never intend to honor is exactly that, a legitimization process. So, the question that I'm often asked is this the end of civilian politics in Sudan because of just how much destruction has been wrought in the country in just 6 weeks? And the answer to that is multivarious, but one thing I would highlight is that there are two wars going on right now. There is the war between SAF and the RSF and their junior partners, which is the one all of us can see. And then there is the war that is being fought by both of them against civilian politics in Sudan. We see that in the way that union members, resistance committee members have been targeted. We see it in the way that civilians have been targeted, markets, businesses, various aspects of daily life, social, political, and economic, have been destroyed through this conflict, not just as collateral but also targeted conflicts. We have seen the way that particularly the RSF has been getting people out of their homes, has been committing all sorts of abuses, has been burning markets. We've seen it in the way that the Sudan Armed Forces has been bombing public buildings. Yes, some of them are occupied by the RSF, but the readiness with which the SAF was willing to use disproportionate firearms to get rid of RSF presence in neighborhoods, in public buildings, has been, I think, quite telling of the extent to which they are willing to destroy aspects of civilian life, infrastructure, schools, hospitals, etc., water, electricity, telecoms towers. All of these things have been under attack, and some of them targeted by both sides. I think when we're thinking about political process in the future, we cannot have these institutions be at the center of any political dispensation. Right now, every sort of conversation around ways out of this political of this conflict and towards other political processes has not sufficiently, I think, centered civilians and civic politics in those processes. We're still seeing an over-dependence and over-reliance on the sort of the two warring factions, and there are two warring factions of the same military project. What we're hearing from both of these actors is not a readiness to do away with militarized politics, as they have been saying through their various PR campaigns. What we're seeing is that both these institutions, both of these groups, want to capture the military project for themselves and fashion a future Sudan in their own image, according to their own vision. And those visions are widely different. And that is really at the heart of this conflict. It's not an issue of integration of the RSF into SAF. It's not an issue of the hierarchy within a security entity during the transition. Those are the secondary sort of considerations. The primary consideration is what kind of Sudan is going to be made in the future. And they both have vastly different ideas of how to do this. And currently, this conflict is predicated on the fact that neither side can see a political dispensation in Sudan where the other one exists, where the other one remains in position, where the other one maintains control over resources, power, people, etc. And that's why you won't get a ceasefire that will hold. That's why you won't get an agreement right now under the current circumstances that will hold, because that those very sort of differing visions are not in any way reconciled. I think the solution is not to try and reconcile one vision to the other. The solution is to ensure that neither of those visions comes to pass, and that a third way, a civilian-centered way, based on rule of law, based on democracy, based on the ideals that people have fought and died for 4 years, that is what should be centered. That is what should be pushed for. Now, is the international community ready to set aside mediation orthodoxies that it's been using since the fall of Bashir, and certainly now, as quite evident in the Jeddah talks? The answer is I don't know. But as we've been in this webinar, the US has sanctioned two entities in the Sudan Armed Forces and 2 in the Rapid Support Forces. And the intention there is to send a signal that a breaking of the ceasefires, which has been frequent and constant, and also the fact that, there's no sort of willingness to abide by any sort of a peace talks, that it would be punished. And sanctions, I think, they are the most impactful if they lie within a broader strategy. So far, we have seen an absence of a strategy. And so where these sanctions may be celebrated because, they're showing some kind of movement, some kind of momentum, some kind of action where it has been missing, it won't really be as effective as it needs be without a proper strategy. And we haven't seen that, not from DC, not from Brussels, not from Addis. And not from the League of Arab States or elsewhere. Alan made a great point, which is that all of these need to coalesce around the same strategy. Now, it's going to be very difficult to herd all of these cats who have very different interests in Sudan, and some of whom are not interested in a civilian and democratic dispensation in Sudan at all. The African Union de-escalation strategy, which has come out in the past few hours, that is to some extent promising, because it sort of tries to correct some of the underlying failures of Jeddah. But it all depends on who animates it, frankly. And what we're hearing is we're going to see very much the same characters that have always led on the Sudan file from the African Union lead on this. And if that's the case, then we can expect that will also fail. There needs to be a very fast, very urgent reassessment of what kind of, who the interlocutors in Sudan are. It is not the generals. What kind of political future there can be. It has to be one that is civilian and towards some kind of democratic dispensation. But even there, I want to finish very quickly because I know we won't have time for questions. What kind of civilians are we inviting to the table? That is a question that only the Sudanese can ask. There is a question about representation and who gets to say that they represent the Sudanese people. Oftentimes, the formations are, for example, resistance committees, unions, particularly unions that have had elections, like the doctors and journalists unions, there can be encouragement of other unions, other resistance committees to follow suit. So there is actual representation. If we rely on the same representation that we saw in 2019, we're not going to get anywhere far, because Sudan has changed massively, even within the civic spaces since then. So reassess how we got here, because that will help us chart a way forward. Figure out how to work in concert, in unison amongst all of this alphabet soup of international organizations, and make sure that the civilians are able to organize themselves, avail the spaces for them to organize themselves and their own representations in charting a way forward and being, frankly, making the process as well as just taking part in it of any future political dispensation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khulud. Appreciate it. Thank you to all the panelists for their remarks. We have quite a few questions. We only have very few minutes. I want to just target some questions, if possible. Alan, you spoke of all the regional actors. One big regional actor was missing, Israel. Where does it stand? In about a minute, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a difficult assignment there, as I think everyone did. Israel, by some accounts, offered to mediate themselves. They have ties to both men. Their policy on this is a bit opaque. Of course, there's the normalization under the Abraham Accords there. So the foreign ministry definitely has ties with Burhan. There's some reports that suggest other parts of the Israeli government, have more ties with Hemeti. So we've seen a bit of hedging on the Israeli side, to be honest. And I don't want to over speculate on this call because it's a bit opaque. But I think it's good to raise them as one of the potential actors in here. I think they're among the people who essentially didn't see this coming and are trying to figure out how to navigate this now.
A question for Khalid. You spoke about the 1989 coup and the Islamist. Basically, it was an Islamist coup. Let's not mince words there. Where are the Islamists today? I mean, everybody is accusing Burhan of because he has an alliance with the Islamists, that's why we're fighting him. I mean, where do these stand? And there's a question also about the political affiliations inside Sudan of the two combatants. You're muted.
Thank you for that question. I know it's a central one. There's, of course, the confusion because Hemeti's propaganda is basically centered around democratization, believe it or not, and the fight against Islamic radicalism. That should not detract from the long history of the building of the economic empire that is linked to specific members of the National Congress Party and the military. That is something that was tackled in the context of trying to dismantle the remnants of the regime. It's one of the central reasons both of these gentlemen, or rather protagonist generals, actually conspired, partnered together. And it is also a reason why they continue to fight in order to safeguard that was built under. There's a network of that. In terms of military, One need not, say that every single general in the Sudan Armed Forces is linked to the National Congress Party of the Islamists, but we can say some of the most important elements of the Sudan Armed Forces are linked to the National Congress Party and are members of the National Congress Party, particularly all of those appointed in the Intelligence and Security Committee, which were appointed by the National Congress Party. That's extremely important. There is no question that the popularity in civil society of the Islamist movement has declined, and that has been a result of a variety of reasons, including the struggle of Sudanese people. And that is one of the reasons there's such desperation on the part of remnants of the National Congress Party and the Islamists in the military. And we do have very good information to say that they had planned and played a central role in the calculations associated with the timing of the conflict that began. In terms of the second question, what was it again, Imad? I'm sorry.
Basically, General, you touched on it. Political affiliations of.
Oh, yes, I do want to mention that. Khulud and others can, of course, corroborate that. This is one of the reasons we hesitate. I understand Alan's issue of and concern, and absolutely understand the notion of the collapsed state and state failure. But the category of this being a civil war is, I would still maintain, incorrect. The reason I say it's incorrect is precisely because of your question. And that is, in civil society, there is absolutely no popular affiliation. And Khulud, unfortunately, itemized for us the wide swath of targeting of a whole array of civilian institutions and groups and associations that really indicate clearly that there is absolutely not only no support in civil society, but civil society is the primary threat to both of these generals.
Yes, thank you, Khalid. Sabah, there is a question about you discussed violations, humanitarian violations. Can you specifically what exact some exact violations of humanitarian situation?
Thank you, Imad. I think the question was related to HAC, the Sudanese Humanitarian Aid Commission. HAC is a body that falls under the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor. It's been an incredibly obstructive and destructive force, not just during the war, but before the war. It always has been. And they've been obstructing the supply of food and medicine that's coming in from INGOs like USAID, from the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, that came from Oman, those shipments across the entire supply chain. So what happens is that the shipments come in on plane. HAC will put in place excessive bureaucracy and reasons why the plane cannot unload, why the permissions for the warehouses haven't been provided yet, why the trucks can't be loaded with the shipments. I mean, there's just a lot of bureaucracy that they put forward to block. And then there's also allegations that some of these shipments are then passed to the hands of the Sudanese armed forces. So some of the food and medicine that is intended for the civilian beneficiaries actually ends up in the hands of the army. And we don't know, it sort of gets lost in the supply chain there. HAC has a central body in Khartoum, and they have decentralized bodies in Medini and Gadaref and Darfur and other places. So, I mean, the INGOs and USAID are very aware of what HAC has been doing. We had a discussion with them the other day, and they said that they are sanctionable because what they are doing is actually obstructing the delivery of aid, which is harming civilians and is part of, the atrocities committed in the war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry. We really are out of time. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the beautiful discussion. Very nice discussion. Unfortunately, it's a very sad occasion. We certainly hope the best for the Sudanese people, and like Khulud said, the civilians have to take it over. Thank you to the audience for sending your questions. I'm really sorry I couldn't get to all your questions. We ran out of time. There will be a video of this webinar a little later today on our website, Arab Center, Washington, DC. Thank you again, and have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.